In this news roundup of a week for July the 1st, 2022, the US Supreme Court rips up a key measure on climate change and makes America a bit less governable even than it already was. Meanwhile, Democrats try to put Roe v. Wade on the ballot for the 2022 elections while taking Donald Trump off the ballot for 2024. Russia hits a major civilian target with significant loss of life, but the G7 responds with juvenile drivel. And in this week's Short Thought, we talk about how your biggest critic might just be your best ally. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. In the US this week, the US Supreme Court continued on its absolute tear by ripping up one of the mechanisms most used by US presidents to get around gridlock in Congress, its delegation of powers to agencies. The focus for the challenge was on climate change, the way that the Obama administration established that the EPA had the power to regulate CO2 emissions under the Clean Air Act. The ruling came in relation to a suit brought by a number of Republican states which argued that the status quo empowered unelected bureaucrats at the expense of democratically elected lawmakers. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said the move gave power back to the people by confirming that only the people's representatives in Congress, not unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, may write our nation's laws. This argument needs to be seen alongside the de facto paralysis of said democratically elected lawmakers thanks to gridlock on most key issues, meaning that states can decide their own policy. De facto, it means the United States is becoming increasingly unable to set national policy on any issues where there's significant political debate in either direction, regardless who wins the election. Writing the opinion for the majority, Chief Justice Roberts said that it was sceptical about the EPA's claim that the law empowers it to devise carbon emissions caps. Under our precedents, this is a major questions case. There is little reason to think Congress assigned such decisions to the agency. The major questions doctrine that Roberts refers to there requires Congress to authorise plainly any sweeping actions by administrative agencies capable of making a major impact on the economy. This doctrine followed from the premise that existing legislation should not be used as a cover for schemes demonstrably different in scope to the intent that it was passed for, or, as it said in a 2001 decision, it does not hide elephants in mouse holes. Now, obviously, a lot of politicians on the left were bemoaning the decision based on the fact that it removed from the Biden administration one of its last vehicles for pursuing climate change policy. But it's key to note that it doesn't stop there. Law Professor Steve Vladek told CNN that the ruling was a major shake-up in modern administrative law. And he said this: "For a century, the federal government has functioned on the assumption that Congress can broadly delegate regulatory power to executive branch agencies. Today's ruling opens the door to endless challenges to those delegations on everything from climate change to food safety standards, on the grounds that Congress wasn't specific enough in giving the agency the power to regulate such major issues." And the ruling by Roberts made the point that, as with Roe v. Wade, the judgment wasn't about the desirability or otherwise of the policy, but about the key question of where the decision should be made. He wrote that capping CO2 emissions to transition away from the use of coal may well be sensible policy, but it is not plausible that Congress gave EPA the authority to adopt on its own such a regulatory scheme. And that, of course, is absolutely true. Congress was gridlocked on any climate policy, so the administration sought to sidestep it. And you can decide where you pitch your tent on this. Do you agree with the judges? What they're doing is handing the decision back to elected representatives rather than the unaccountable bureaucrats, as they say and as Republicans support. Or instead, do you argue that by taking the action of handing the decision back from the competent expert authority to a de facto gridlocked system, the justices take on themselves a political role that reliably prevents climate action from being taken, as argued by the Democrats, And this was the case made in the dissenting judgment, written by Justice Elena Kagan. The court appoints itself, instead of Congress or the expert agency, the decision maker on climate policy. The dissenting judgment also observed that this actually doesn't make any difference to the original measure on which it purports to pronounce, the Clean Power Plan, since it wasn't actually enacted, and market forces had led the energy industry to meet the original targets anyway. But the ruling will preempt new legislation that the EPA would plan to bring in, which was the real target. There's no doubt that the unintended, presumably, consequence of all of this is that the United States has become uniquely enfeebled when it comes to international agreements. Any tin pot dictator, any grey weakling can sit across the table from the President of the United States, whoever that may be at the time, and know that he or she has the power to commit to a course to action, but the US President does not. Specifically on climate, the US states will de facto have the power to decide their own climate policy, but the heads of those states will not be present at the international summits, will not be negotiating. The heads of the tiniest Pacific islands will be there, but not the heads of Texas or Florida or any other state. Only the US president, who has the power to deliver nothing. It is the dysfunction you expect of a country that is already in the midst of a civil war, which is what I've now rather concluded is the case, albeit one that's being conducted via mechanisms mostly falling short of violence. Meanwhile, the shockwaves continue to be felt in the US following the other seismic Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade. The open question has been whether or not the move, with the subsequent rapid actions by Republican states to impose bans on their own territory, whether those might impact their expected strong performance of Republicans in the midterm elections in November. You generally assume that the Democrats would seek to maximise that likelihood by pulling together, making themselves the voice of reason to contrast against the extremism of the other side. But this is America, so what they did instead was apparently to do whatever they could to undermine their chances of making that happen, by publicly criticising and attacking their own president for not taking this on with direct action, not much caring that the executive has few powers to even do that if it wanted to. So there have been multiple headlines saying things like Democratic exasperation builds at Biden's slow roll on Roe, that one from Politico, and the New York Times proclaiming that for many Democrats, Biden's initial reaction had been, quote, painfully inadequate, which is obviously such a great rallying cry for the voters. Senior figures such as Elizabeth Warren came up with a bucket list of potential actions they thought the president could take, such as covering expenses for federal employees who want to travel to get an abortion, helping to pay for out-of-state abortions, maybe even opening up federal lands to abortion procedures in states that don't allow it. The White House has hit back with some irritation, pointing out that, for instance, opening abortion clinics on federal land, as suggested, would probably put women and abortion providers at risk of prosecution. And what hasn't been said, but is reasonably obvious because we've seen it traditionally in the first few days of every new president's tenure, what's been established by executive order can be, and usually will be, reversed by executive order as soon as power changes hands. The point is that what's speaking is the outrage of people who are raging at their powerlessness in the face of the Supreme Court's action. So the instinct is to do something, anything, right now, rather than to evaluate, as they should have been doing over the last couple of months since the draft judgment leak, what would be the most effective longer-term course of action. If you did that, then probably turning on each other in public wouldn't be near the top of the list. In any case, while polls show that the majority of Americans disapprove of the court's action, the court is not an elected body. And how much, therefore, Roe will be on the ballot, as Democrats insist, remains to be seen by the time November comes along. The other thing Democrats hope will be on the ballot, even though he won't be, actually on the ballot, is Donald Trump. This week, there was an unexpected additional hearing of the January 6th inquiry, where the world was presented with reportedly blockbuster testimony which sought to prove the case that the committee is making, that Trump knowingly and deliberately sought violent insurrection and therefore renders himself legally culpable. It's hard to make this stick more than it has already. Multiple sources and witnesses have already attested via interviews and a small flow of tell-all books the degree of self-delusion that Trump brought to the situation. Here was a man who had fought a bad campaign because he couldn't get on message in any strategic way. He ended up doing better than expected in spite of that, maybe because of it. And yet, because he only listened to people who told him what he wanted to hear, he became increasingly convinced that the election had been stolen. You can read the blow-by-blow detail of how all of that happened, for instance, in Michael Wolff's book on the final days of the administration, Landslide. And as the sensible people ran out of ways to tell Trump what he wanted to hear, they mostly left. And increasingly unhinged people were left to fill the vacuum. Now, most people would read that and conclude this was a man not really suited to high office, or indeed any office, arguably. But the point is that those books appeared over the last couple of years, and in some polls you would still see Trump polling better than Biden for 2024. So the January 6th Commission seems intent on flipping the script from one where Trump is narcissistic, living in his own reality, deluded, which bizarrely does not seem to qualify him from becoming elected president, to one where he is evil and manipulative and a strategic mastermind coming up with his plots to overturn the peaceful transfer of power, because that might mean that he could be legally blocked from becoming president. This is one of those areas where partisans of both sides render themselves largely incapable of judging what's likely to happen due to the extent of wishful thinking they bring to the table. So the testimony hasn't been quite as impactful as they might have hoped. I mean, this week's witness, Cassidy Hutchinson, reported that she'd been told that Trump had lunged for the steering wheel of his car and assaulted one of the security guards when they refused to take him to the Capitol building. Note, that was a third-party anecdote, not something she'd seen directly. It was reported in breathless terms as a shocking revelation. But very soon afterwards, journalists were reporting that the security officials concerned had said that they were prepared to testify that it didn't happen. As well, reportedly Trump, bothered by the smaller size of his audience than he'd wished, had told his people to turn off the metal detectors, keeping out people who were carrying guns. "They're not here to hurt me," he said. I would take that as being, give me my big audience. My people are gun supporters, so lots of them probably are carrying guns, but they're not a risk. But of course, if you want to imply evil, manipulative Trump, you say that sentence, "They're not here to hurt me," should be, "They're not here to hurt me," wink wink, "just here to attack my enemies as I intended, ha 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 ha." So partisans on one side will point to the fact he told them that they had to fight like hell to prevail. And they breathlessly add, "He said that, knowing that some people in the crowd were armed." Meanwhile, partisans on the other side point out that, well, yeah, but he also said in the same speech that they should demonstrate peacefully. He literally used that word. And the history to date had been that any random thing we know could come from Trump's mouth at any random time. I mean, we do remember that, right? His administration spent a good period of time rowing back on random stuff that it had occurred to him at some point to say to a journalist. Most people would hold that should be a disqualifying feature right there. I'm pretty sure that even relatively recently that would have been held to be the case. But trying to take him off the ballot by making the case he should be criminally charged is going to stoke those Civil War dynamics further into places you might not intend. What's the second best way to guarantee your 2024 election descends into chaos and disrepute? Arguably, yes, having Donald Trump on the ballot, the man who will argue that he can only lose because the other side cheats. But what's the single best way to guarantee that it ends badly? probably using the law to keep Donald Trump off the ballot, thereby giving all his supporters the proof that they would ever need that the election has been fixed. Now, it may be that while most Republicans do not trust the managers of the January 6th committee as reliable narrators, they are nevertheless getting tired of the drama that constantly comes with Trump. We've seen a steady rise over the last month in polling for Ron DeSantis versus Trump as the candidate for the next election. DeSantis has a lot to commend him to the Republican base. He is sufficiently Trump-like in his policy and his rhetoric to attract their support, but he is a competent, functioning human being in a way that didn't used to be considered a bar you might fail to meet and still be considered to be a contender. He has been arguably effective as an elected political official and much more disciplined in his campaign rhetoric. Democrats might well find that rather alarming. Maybe that puts some pressure on them to find someone similarly capable, which wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. Right now, it's an open question. You could end up in 2024 with two dysfunctional old guys barely able to speak a coherent sentence, just taking swings at each other with their walking sticks. Or you could end up with two, still politically rather polarised, no doubt, but competent politicians making their case within a still just about democratic system. I can't help but think that even with all the flaws, one of those is a preferable proposition. That may well have crossed a few minds of the recent G7 and NATO summits, although I expect it was only spoken out loud in hushed whispers in the corridor. While the G7 groups of countries was meeting this week, President Putin apparently sent them a message by having a couple of missiles fired against a crowded shopping mall in the city of Kremenchuk. The move, involving major lethal force being used against a significant civilian gathering point, was immediately branded as a war crime, and Ukraine's President Zelensky called for Russia to be branded as a state sponsor of terrorism, a designation that would have had it joining Iran, North Korea, Cuba and Syria. That was something that France's President Macron declined to do, although he joined the chorus about war crimes over the recent attack. Simply underlining once again how the divisions are now opening up in European resolve. The Russian government did its usual trick in this situation of issuing denials which didn't even bother to be consistent within themselves, let alone the voluminous evidence to the contrary. The mall hadn't been hit by Russian missiles, but had caught fire from an attack on a nearby military target in a factory was one. Never mind that one piece of CCTV footage literally shows the missile hitting the mall. And the target was not the factory or the mall, but a nearby train yard, even though satellite images show that there was no damage to the train yard. And the mall was closed anyway, only inhabited by military personnel, so it was a legitimate target. But of course there are multiple streams of evidence to the contrary, including various people on the ground who shared receipts from things that they bought in that mall over the last few days on social media. And alternatively on social media, pages from stores expressing condolences to the families of their employees that were victims of the attack. I felt slightly embarrassed last week because I did a debunking video that, when I got into the detail, turned out to be absurdly easy, because what was being presented as evidence was demonstrably not remotely supportive of the claims that were being made. But it's worth noting briefly, that is exactly the standard of claims being made by Russia on a routine basis in the course of this war. It doesn't do so because it believes the evidence stacks up, but almost because it knows that it doesn't. This Russian thing I've referenced before, telling someone a lie, knowing full well that they know it's a lie, but looking them in the eyes and telling it anyway. The intended intellectually disorientating effect of a constant stream of alternative reality matched to actions of objectively obvious violence. If you want to see the Bellingcat report, where they link to and detail all the social media evidence in this case, I link to it below. But there has to come a time where on this channel we move beyond the practice of explaining reality to idiots, so I am not going to waste time on the details of such claims from now on, unless there's a situation where there's a credible dispute of fact or interpretation. Mind you, such seriousness of intent did not seem to be the order of the day at the actual G7 meeting, where discussions were had and publicised about, I kid you not, how they should all strip off to counter Putin's topless promo photos. And President Putin responded by pointing out possibly the first true thing that he said in 2022, that this would probably be a rather disgusting sight. Really? Do we have any leaders at all left that can rise above the level of blithering idiocy? Apparently not. Boris Johnson then compounded the nonsense by claiming in an interview that Putin wouldn't have invaded Ukraine if he'd been a woman. And this was an example of toxic masculinity, an argument that would have raised the eyebrows, one would suggest, of Putin's historic predecessor, Catherine the Great. And indeed likewise for Johnson's predecessor, Margaret Thatcher, come to that. Meanwhile, back in the real world, this week Russia reportedly started shipping grain from parts of Ukraine that are under its control. One vessel carrying 7,000 tons of grain left Berdyansk to go to what Russia described as friendly countries. Ukraine has accused Moscow of stealing its grain for some time now, something that Russia had denied, while those verifiable observations very much seem to confirm them. Also verified by satellite photos is the fact that Russia withdrew this week from the little Snake Island that was the first place they occupied during the invasion. In recent weeks, Ukraine forces have been attacking the troops stationed there with missile and drone strikes, while resupply ships were hit with anti-ship missiles. In keeping with the vision of the brutal war as a carry-on comedy, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed the withdrawal was, quote, a goodwill gesture. Minutes later, its missiles were hitting civilian targets in Odessa, a residential building and a recreation centre, because nothing says goodwill quite like bombing a population back to the Stone Age. Yesterday, as I record this video, the organisation I used to work for, Business in the Community, had a reunion event for former staffers. It got me reflecting on the key difference between the two chief executives that had been there during my time, and particularly in how they operated. The first was often described as a force of nature, often did many great things, made many mistakes as well, but welcomed strong people who would stand up to her if they thought she was wrong. Now, it didn't happen a lot. Mostly chief executives get surrounded by people who are competing to tell them what they want to hear, leaving bad news or dissenting views to the other people. But I was the same then as I am now, so I said what I thought and mostly did fine doing that. Because for all of her merits and her flaws, she understood that if a leader is surrounded by the people who only tell them what they want to hear, then they probably never get to know what's really going on. And that makes for bad decision making. So she at least respected people who were prepared to push back, as indeed do I if they do so with a coherent argument in the comment section of these videos. The subsequent CEO was different. He did not enjoy being challenged especially, and my impression is that in that he was probably more typical of your average CEO. It became obvious over time I was not going to thrive under that particular regime, and I started to plan my exit accordingly. But not taking pushback is a real failing. It's one reason why people in charge often start strong, but then over time the sureness of their instincts gradually desert them, because those instincts are no longer routinely being informed by the reality they need in order to make good decisions. And we're seeing that today writ large, with the stories of the last days of the Trump administration we've been talking about, and in Putin's conduct of the early stage of the Ukraine war that we've been talking about. You don't have to have been a CEO or president to get the point of this story. The people who are your biggest critics may, at least if they can be constructive in their criticism, be your best friends in life. It just takes a mind shift change. Going from rejecting dissension because you presume you must be wholly right, which will eventually over time, gradually step by step make you wholly wrong, or embracing dissension and listening because you know you're not perfect, and every person who is prepared to do you a favour of telling you what they actually think, those are maybe not telling you what you want to hear, taking the difficult step of telling you maybe what you need to hear. They are your real friends, the ones that help you to get better. Now, of course, there's a difference between constructive dissent and the idiots who just troll people and call them names and try to undermine their confidence and whatever. But it's actually entirely possible to tell the difference between those, which doesn't mean your critics won't sometimes be annoying. It doesn't mean that they won't often be wrong, but you will do best if you appreciate them anyway and go out of your way to hear their voices, not simply clear them out of your earshot. Again, you can't change who gets to run Russia, but you can learn the lessons for your own life. Namely, welcome the critical voices gladly. Don't necessarily presume others will welcome it gladly when you do the same, however. All right. Also, don't presume everyone will welcome it when you talk about controversial topics. Not entirely unexpectedly, YouTube demonetized the video I made earlier this week on the US abortion debate, meaning that it couldn't carry advertising. Now, I appealed that, and it was reversed once a human being at their end took a look at it, but of course by then it's already had the majority of views it's going to, so it's pretty academic at that point. That will usually be the case when I deal with any of the more difficult topics, but they're kind of the things that we should be talking about. So I'm not going to avoid them simply because of the risk of demonetization. And I'm stubborn enough to do that regardless, just as I will refuse to do some of the things YouTube's algorithm would like me to do if I think it goes in the wrong direction. I am perfectly capable of cutting off my nose to spite my face. I might as well make a feature out of it. Fortunately, no such radical face surgery is needed thanks to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Thanks to that select and important band of people, I am able to make the videos that should be made without worrying about what will or will not find favour with YouTube. I simply wouldn't be able to produce the videos at all, in fact, without them. If you would like to join that important group in supporting the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.